Welcome to Stepsero. Modern work is a lot. Let's take it one conversation at a time. My guest today is Cecilia Steenbuch Traberg, who has a PhD in psychology from the University of Cambridge and is an assistant professor of digitalisation at Copenhagen Business School. In this episode, we touch on a paper she co authored on AI and scientific monoculture, why AI might make you more productive and everyone else busier, and what AI might be doing to your sense of purpose at work. Let's get into it. Cecilia, welcome to the Stepsero podcast. Thank you so much for making the time.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to talk with you today.
And I'm very excited to have you as a guest. I've been looking forward to this for a while now. And Cecilia, you have been recently, not so long ago, named one of Denmark's 100 women in AI. So guess what today's topic will be, obviously. For those people who don't know you, may I ask you to share a very brief overview of your background and where your main expertise lies?
Yes, so I am trained as a psychologist. I did 2 master's degrees in psychology, one at UCL and one at Cambridge, and then a PhD in psychology at Cambridge as well, where I studied the psychology of social influence in relation to technology and how it's changing the information ecosystem. Now I'm an assistant professor at Copenhagen Business School at the Department of Digitalisation. So here I focus on digital influence as well as how artificial intelligence is changing our information ecosystem and the way we engage with information and the way we engage with our work and thinking in general. So really, I kind of study the intersection between psychology and technology.
Fantastic. Look, there is a lot we can cover, and we have somehow limited amount of time because of the format of this podcast. And if that's okay, I'd like to start with a paper that you co-authored. It is titled AI is Turning Research into a Scientific Monoculture. Now, I read the paper. I found it very insightful, but I have the chance to ask you directly. Can you somehow expose the central argument of the paper?
Yes. So in this paper, we essentially argue that at the individual level, a lot of scholars are increasingly turning to both using artificial intelligence systems and tools in their day-to-day work. And at the same time, researchers across fields are increasingly studying artificial intelligence. So it's both, the paper both discusses artificial intelligence as an object of study and as a tool to study things. And what we kind of argue in the paper is that as scholars increasingly both rely on these systems to produce their work as well as study these systems, this is kind of creating an epistemic monoculture in which we're kind of using the same tools. We're using the tool to study the tool, and everything is kind of at the collective level converging towards a monoculture. That is, everybody is kind of studying the same thing in the same way, and we risk that we're not engaging with perspectives that we might otherwise have engaged with, and we're not studying things in kind of more creative ways that we used to. And this is kind of creating this feedback loop in which we are, increasingly talking in the same way, and our papers are being fed into the same systems, which are then helping us study the systems. And at the end of the day, what we're kind of reaching is then uh, a lack of creative diversity and a lack of diverse perspectives to even study the tools that we're using to study the tools, etc.
So, am I saying correctly, or am I thinking correctly when I say that the risk based on the arguments in the paper is that we will all, and I'm simplifying, of course, but we will all soon, in a way, sound alike because we rely on the same information that we ourselves feed the models with. So we are somehow building a walled garden for ourselves. And not just that, but we also will get to a point where we ask the same questions. So we will think of problems the same way.
Exactly, exactly. So you could say it's both at the language level that we all start to sound the same. And it's kind of just getting worse and worse and worse because when we all started to use these systems, they were trained on human written language and databases of what was written by humans. Now, increasingly, as humans are using these tools to write, the data that the models are trained on is increasingly also artificial. So what's being fed back to us is kind of turning more and more artificial at a language level. But then it's also the idea that everything that these models are trained on is what has been studied before and like the history of human thinking, whereas generating new ideas kind of requires to think outside of the toolbox. So the question is whether by relying on the same data to generate new ideas, are we neglecting ideas that we wouldn't be able to come up with via using artificial intelligence tools? But then a third kind of aspect that I'm not sure if we kind of go deeply into in the paper, but it's kind of like an overarching theme of the paper, and that is the risk of not looking outside artificial intelligence tools to solve problems in general. So we might be thinking about all problems in the world right now in terms of, can we use artificial intelligence for this? Can we use it to, make democratic discourse more open, more inclusive? Can we use artificial intelligence to improve our business? Can we use artificial intelligence to improve my website? Can we use it to kind of solve global crises, etc.? But, with all researchers kind of turning towards trying to see whether we can use these systems to improve these problems, we kind of risk that we're not exploring alternative options in terms of trying to solve the problems we're trying to solve.
There is a part that I noted down because I thought it was very insightful in the paper, and it's about the rush effect, you call it.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
I'm quoting you directly. You write, to not work on AI is increasingly perceived as a missed opportunity, or worse, irrelevance.
Right.
And this I found very, very insightful, actually spot on, because we are in academia, in professional settings, everywhere and beyond, we are pushed to produce more and move faster, which begs the question, are we actually gaining in productivity, right? This is the big question these days. Everyone is asking the same thing. Are we becoming more productive, or are we just producing more slop?
Right.
What's your idea of that? Is there an actual productivity gain in pushing people to almost blindly adopt AI?
I think it's a bit of a paradox, and in the sense that at the individual level, people can become more productive. People can produce things faster. People can potentially, some people might have like quality gains as well from using artificial intelligence tools. And of course, it depends on the task at hand. But if we kind of see it from the research perspective, then yes, there's a productivity gain at the individual level. But what kind of starts to happen at the collective level is that because everyone is more productive, this means we're kind of also generating more work for each other, as in everybody's writing more papers. This means that there is more papers to review. This means that there are more papers to read. In order for you to have summarized the existing literature, for example, there are many more papers that you need to read in order to be able to, create your new article or establish a new experiment or a new research study. So at the individual level, we're becoming more productive, but we're kind of also creating more work for ourselves because it's kind of coming back to us. The increase of other people's productivity is generating more emails for us, more things to respond to. And that means that kind of at the collective level, we're not really gaining more time. And also, I do also see this posing a risk to the quality of our work because we're because we're creating more work. This means that people might be tempted to take shortcuts in order to do that work. And these shortcuts will, in the long term, result in us being worse at what we're doing because we're outsourcing what we're supposed to do to, for example, a conversational chatbot.
And indeed, it looks like similar patterns are emerging, not just in academia, but in professional settings, in companies.
Hmm.
Based on your perspective and what you see in your research, in your students, in the conversations that you have, and I know this is somehow the $1 million question out there, but if a manager or a team lead or anybody who is somehow supervising people and teams and departments wanted to, in a way, resist this flattening
Hmm.
that we are seeing, is there any concrete thing that they could do that is, in a way, easy to implement, that is not asking for too many resources?
As in terms of implementing artificial intelligence?
Or going about the way we implement artificial intelligence. So avoiding this adoption at all costs, avoiding giving into this rush, in a way.
Right. Yes, that's a really good question. I think my main advice would be to really evaluate at what point in your work process or the company's work process this could be meaningfully integrated, and really do a thorough kind of due diligence before implementation and not implementing at all costs. Seeing where things could improve processes, not just in the short term, but also kind of doing a strategic evaluation of how this will impact both productivity and employees' well-being and decision making in the long run. Because, for instance, at scale, for example, in a creative business, at scale, designers and artists and creatives are increasingly also trying to yell out quite loud that everything creative is also being flattened, as in promotional material starts to look the same, communication material starts to look the same, websites look the same. So many things look similar, meaning that if you're trying to kind of use these tools to differentiate yourselves or for communication purposes, in the beginning it could look like there are some gains, but in the long run it could actually potentially worsen how your audience or your customers or your consumers see you. It could also lead to worse outcomes on the internal side in terms of employee satisfaction. If you're taking away people's kind of core reason for being, or like raison d'etre for being in that company, by having them use AI tools, you might also kind of decrease their satisfaction. However, I think a process that kind of must be implemented before adoption and after kind of strategic evaluation is a proper training for employees. Exactly what is it you want them to use it for? How do you want them to use it? And why do you want them to use it? So that they kind of get an understanding of these tools that they're supposed to be using, why and how to use them. Because otherwise, you risk that people also can adopt tools, even if they're kind of willing to and they like using them, that they adopt them uncritically. They end up sending slides that they can't verify. They end up sending communication material that they can't verify. And they end up not having a real part in the process, which could also kind of lead to worse outcomes. But if you're training them properly, you might actually improve your outcomes. So it's all about, figuring out where in the process and giving them the proper tools to do it. And then actually maybe a final point is leadership training as well, because there is also recent research evaluating the introduction of these tools in companies that highlights that some of the risks are not that people necessarily use the tools wrong or don't adopt the tool. It's not necessarily that the tools themselves are creating worse outcomes, but it is that if leaders have an over reliance on or an overconfidence in these systems, they might check things less, showing that because people and leaders have such a high trust currently in these tools and they check things less, that means that you actually end up with more missed errors. If you're kind of missing those errors because you're trusting the tools more, that at scale can also lead to risks in the company.
You touched on a couple of things that I feel like quite crucial, like you mentioning this taking away the reason for being for professionals, for employees, and the other is this over reliance on AI, right? And there is this beautiful article I came across, I believe it was last week or something. I found it on LinkedIn. It's called AI's Catastrophic Risk Isn't Rogue Machines, It's Cognitive Surrender. And it was published on techpolicy.press. And in a nutshell, it says that actually, I noted down this quote: AI erodes something harder to quantify, the identity that mastery once conferred. And I thought, nailed it, because this is exactly, in a way, what you mentioned when you say taking away the reason for being. The relationship to effort has changed, right?
Mhm.
We leave everything to LLMs, to AI, and we expect to have a result right away because that's the way we are used to. So we input something, we want the result right away. So inevitably, the way we think of effort or cognitive effort is very different compared to the way we used to think about it a few years back. And it's also making me think of a conversation that I've had on the podcast recently. This was with Leanne Shelton. She's an AI trainer, and she jokingly, not so jokingly maybe, said that she pictures a potential new job role that could emerge in the future, which is similar to carers of dementia patients. And she calls this an AI reversal support person. So basically, a support for people who are no longer used to leverage their own cognitive skills, right? That they've lost this touch. They just blindly relied on something that was ready to use over the years. And these are the results. And then in the future, we'll need someone to teach them to write a letter, make a shopping list, and so on and so forth. Now, of course, we are in a way, hopefully, fantasizing. But as a final question to this conversation, may I ask you, Cecilia, are you positive about where things are going? When you look at the future, what do you see?
I think the sad but quick answer is no. I'm not optimistic about the future, at least as it kind of currently looks. The current trajectory of where artificial intelligence is going in work, in research, and in general in our lives, I think it is going at such a fast pace that we are not paying enough attention to the risks alongside of it. And we should be employing a lot more guardrails at the individual, educational, societal, and organizational level. However, I think that researchers and practitioners who are kind of researching the risks and calling out the risks are increasingly getting heard. And I think that can help offset some of the potential damage. That's not to say that I don't think that there are definitely positives of artificial intelligence. It's just that at scale, I do kind of fear for what will happen before we implement the guardrails that I think we need to implement.
Is there anything that we haven't had the chance to touch on during this recording that you want to get off your chest or you feel like it's really important to discuss?
Well, I think your point on cognitive surrender is also really important. And I think that that's also just a risk that leaders should be aware of the longer that they kind of have their employees use these tools for their everyday tasks. It is also kind of lowering the amount of friction. And I think this also will make things more difficult for the lower level tasks and for the younger employees that enter companies, because at the end of the day, we need people who understand systems and processes to be able to even manage and like check what's being produced by artificial intelligence. And in order to produce those people, they need to have some training in doing the work that is currently being outsourced to AI. So you need to have a bit of both, even in companies as well, at least from my perspective.
Cecilia, you've been awesome. I really appreciate you taking the time and coming on the podcast. And I really hope we can do this again at some point in the future.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it.